Following Jesus brings challenges, struggles, opportunities, and adventure. Are you ready for what lies ahead? Following Jesus is an adventure. It's not just something that we do on Sunday mornings. We're not Christians, we're not saved so that we can simply sit down and warm a pew for an hour, hour and 15 minutes every Sunday. There is more to it than that. Our entire lives are dedicated to serving Jesus. And this adventure captivates our hearts, our minds, our desires, our entire being. But it brings us many challenges and many little adventures along the way. And to help us in this journey, in this adventure called Faith and Walking with Jesus, we're going to be starting a new mini-series for 3 weeks that is going to help us with this. We're going to be looking at the book of Titus. Titus was a guy who himself was on a little bit of an island adventure. He was left on this island of Crete to do some more work that Paul had intended to help grow and guide the church in its infancy. So we're going to be joining Titus on his island adventure. We're going to be going on an island adventure ourselves to help us with our adventure of faith. But when you think about going on an adventure, going on some island excursion, maybe you're thinking of going to some awesome place like Hawaii. That would be awesome. Climbing some mountains or looking at those beautiful beaches. If you're going to some place, some island adventure, you're going to need a guide. You're going to need somebody who can help you navigate the terrain and the politics and all the things that you have going on at your destination. But you don't just need any kind of a guide. You need guides who are properly prepared. You don't just say, hey, you person standing on the side of the street, would you please help me on my adventure? That would be a very bad idea. You need somebody who is adequately prepared for the task. They need to know the lay of the land. They need to know the weather and different environmental factors at play. They need to know how to handle unexpected events that might happen. They need to be able to know how to guide you from where you are to where you want to be. They need to know the right safety precautions to take, the equipment that you're going to need. They're going to need to know the geography and the different challenges that is going to present and how to deal with those. Sarah and I, when we were on our honeymoon, we went on a whitewater rafting trip. And they didn't have enough guides for all the boats, correct? And so they had some guides, but they didn't have enough guides. And they said, okay, how many of you have been whitewater rafting before? And Sarah put her hand up and she said, I have. You know, I had too, but I was not about to volunteer for this. She was a little bit more bold than I. And so what they did was they recruited people who had been whitewater rafting before to be the guides for the boats. And they were supposed to follow the lead guide down this river. Which this is kind of an insane situation because for those people who had never been on this river, you don't know the layout of the river. You don't know the rapids. You don't know the different obstacles that are going to be in place in this river. And so Sarah had to help guide our boat to follow the other boats down this river. And as you can see, we survived the trip from Sarah's great guidance. She's a great woman. But that is normally not an acceptable thing, and I wonder what their insurance company would have had to say about this, because that's a huge liability. We didn't have enough guides, and so we had to go on an impromptu search for people who had at least been in a boat on water before. So this was a dangerous situation. But it wasn't too bad of a river. We survived. I'd been on worse, so it was okay. But in normal situations, you don't want just somebody who has minimal experience in a boat leading people down a river where they could fall out and drown. And you would expect, and if you're going mountain climbing or if you're going backcountry hiking, if you're new to that area and you want a guide, you need somebody who is well prepared. And so if it is that important, going on little adventures, outdoor adventures, if it's that important in those places, how much more important should it be in our spiritual life? Which, you know, when I say spiritual life, I don't mean that we should segment our spiritual life from all our entire life. Our spiritual life should be all of our life, okay? So when it comes to spiritual things, when it comes to navigating the waters of life and trying to do it in a way that pleases Jesus, how much more important is it for us to have proper guides in our adventure? It is very important. It is even more important than having a guide that's not going to let you fall off a cliff. And so as we look at this, as we're going to look at Titus chapter 1 today, we're going to see that the church needs guides. People who know and show the way. And recruiting guides is the primary reason why Paul had left Titus on the island of Crete. But I think when it comes to church life and having guides to guide us, there are a couple of problems that we tend to run into. And that is, one of them is our standards for the guides, for leaders, do not always match God. Sometimes we can be too strict or we can be not strict enough. But oftentimes, I think the worst problem that we have is the bigger problem, is that we don't think we need guides. That we think that we can go it alone, that it's just me and Jesus, and I don't need somebody telling me what to do. I don't need somebody guiding me. I don't need somebody correcting me. I don't need somebody teaching me. I just read the Word of God myself, which we all should be reading the Word of God ourselves. We should understand it for ourselves. But sometimes we think we can be this Lone Ranger Christian going off and doing life, and we don't need anybody else to guide us. And neither of these mistakes that we might make are going to give us good spiritual outcomes to life. And so we're going to be learning from Titus chapter 1 today what kind of guides we need and why we need them. So we're going to begin looking at verse 5. Paul says to Titus, "This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained in order, and to appoint elders in every town as I directed to you." So this is going to be a fairly challenging task for Titus to undergo. This is an infant church that hadn't been around for very long, and it's a geographically challenging area as well. And so he's going to have to travel, most likely by foot, to go to these various towns and help these fledgling churches find good leaders, to appoint elders in each of the towns. And I want to make a special mention that he says multiple elders in each city. The Greek construction is rather clear that churches are to have multiple people, multiple elders guiding the flock. It is not a one-man show. It is not a thing where you have the pastor. That is a very dangerous situation, especially if you have a jerk-faced preacher who only looks out for himself. Then that can be a rather bad situation. And so in the church, there are multiple people charged with the task to be guides for the congregation. It is a team effort where there is a balance and there is a camaraderie and there is a multitude of outlooks and perspectives on different situations. He goes on to say, "If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers and not open to the charge of debauchery or insubordination, for an overseer as God's steward must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine, and also to rebuke those who contradict it." Now, when you look at this is a list of requirements that Paul lays out for people who are to be church elders. And if you look at this list, how many skills are listed here? He doesn't list skills. Now, skills for elders are important. We want people who are equipped for the job. However, the primary emphasis that Paul has here is that they have good spiritual and character qualities, that they are men of good character and of good, strong spirit, have a good, strong spiritual walk. Skills are necessary, but they are towards the bottom of the list of things that are important. And what is important is that they are living out the teachings of Jesus in all aspects of their life. When you look at this list, their walk with Jesus, it affects their family, it affects their reputation, it affects their temperament and their self-control, and how they are hospitable towards other people. They're living out what they read and know in Scripture. So properly prepared leaders have proven character. It's not about their age, whether they're old enough, how much they tithe, if they deserve it, if they are a person of influence, how long they have been a member of a church, whether or not they're just a name to fill a slot. It's about if they are living out the teachings of Jesus in their lives. And this whole list is important. Sometimes, though, in the past, not necessarily in this congregation, but in churches I have seen, sometimes we make excuses for why sometimes we don't have to apply some of these things. That we make excuses like guys will be guys, nobody's perfect, and we allow some major character flaws to exist that Paul says ought not to exist. Maybe because of their money, or maybe because they were elected, or maybe because, despite their serious shortcomings, they have a good heart, or some other excuse. Now, this doesn't mean that Paul says that elders are to be perfect, although we have some perfect elders. We do. We have the best, perfectest elders in the world. And you have the best preacher in the world, too, because I'm an elder, too. I'm the best. They're the best. Now, it doesn't mean that elders are to be perfect, by no means of the imagination. But it does mean that we hold them to high standards, and we hold ourselves to high standards as well, and that we look for people to be our guides who are of good quality, of good character. Now, there are many things, many issues with this list. Sometimes we can be overly nitpicky and apply these requirements to situations that don't necessarily apply. Like if an elder has grown children who they have rejected Jesus, that is not to be held against an elder because that is way outside of their bounds for control. But if they have children in their house, that they need to be teaching their children and they need to be disciplining their children as well. So if I'm disciplining my kids and I'm teaching them about Jesus, that is what I'm held accountable to, not for the decisions of grown adults who make their own choices. And there are others that people throw red flags about. And really these are to be taken on a case-by-case and a discussion with the people and looking at their character and seeing how they apply. Okay, so this whole list is important. But there are a couple of things that Paul is emphasizing that I also want to emphasize. Twice he says that they are to be above reproach, that they are to be blameless. So he says it twice, and so it's important. If somebody is repeating, if somebody like Paul in the short letter is repeating something twice within a few verses, it is important to note. So he says twice that they are to be blameless. That means if somebody accuses them of doing something, which happens in leadership, people are going to falsely accuse you. They're going to gossip about you. I mean, just probably go listen to some conversations at West End, and you'll hear this kind of stuff happening. And you read things on Facebook. People are going to gossip. They're going to make false accusations. And so when these accusations are made, when you evaluate their life and you see the things they're doing, the charges aren't going to stick. Okay? But sometimes I think what happens is we listen to the person making the accusation and we immediately say, well, that person isn't a good person, so let's not let them be a leader. And so we have to evaluate and see, that's just gossip. It doesn't hold true. So it is important to be living a consistent Christian walk is really the emphasis. That they are consistently walking with Jesus in all areas of their life. And so if somebody does make an accusation, that's just dumb. They would never do that. And the second thing is that he highlights that they need to know the Word and they need to teach the Word. And he says that this is comprised of two tasks, that they teach proper doctrine and they rebuke people who believe the wrong things. When there are people who are spreading false teaching, that they rebuke them. They say, stop teaching that, which requires that they know the Word to be able to rebuke them. And so in the teaching of being a teacher of the Word doesn't necessarily mean that they stand in front and preach all the time, but it happens in a variety of ways, whether it is giving communion meditations or whether it's teaching Sunday school or maybe it is preaching. There are many different occasions where, even in personal conversations, where this takes place. So these are the really important things that Paul highlights. Now, I want us to note that this is a difficult task. This is not something to take lightly. This is hard. This takes effort. There's a lot of work that goes into maintaining their walk with Jesus and in helping to maintain that the flock is following Jesus. So this is something that we should respect, that we should look up to our elders, and we should see the job that they do, and we should respect them for the diligent work that they do. It takes guts, especially to rebuke people and to correct people when they are going astray. And not just should we respect them, but we also ought to submit to them. That they aren't just guys, coaches who give us suggestions, but they are to be leaders. And that means that we are to follow and to submit to their leading rather than nitpick and complain and whine every 2 seconds about what is going on. Because we all have our own way and our own opinions, and sometimes we need some people to just say, you know what, we're going to do this despite all the opinions and input that we have received. We're going to go this way, we're going to do this thing, and we should be able to listen. Okay, so God calls prepared people to guide the church. It is quite obvious in this chapter that Paul is trying to help Titus understand the kind of people that we should be recruiting for this task and the role that they play in the church. Now, he mentions the teaching part because that is going to come to play here in a second, that there are some dangers ahead that they have to confront. In verse 10, he says, "For there are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers, and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party." That in the church, elders and leaders have to deal with people who are causing trouble, that are disobedient, that when there is instruction given or if there is teaching given, that people don't want to hear it. And in their particular case, there were a group of people running around called the circumcision party, that they were telling people that in order to follow Jesus fully, you also have to follow the Old Testament law. And this was a problem that the early church dealt with a bunch in all kinds of situations. And so in context, they need to be aware of the fact that these guys are false teachers and they should be ignored. And not just, well, not ignored, that they need to be rebuked for their false teaching. And so there is a reinforcement for the need for elders to be strong in the Word so that they can properly correct this kind of false teaching. And this particular teaching was false because we know Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament law. He had completed it, and he had given us a new law, a new covenant in his blood. So the general truth that we read from this verse is that people are going to teach lies and they're going to rebel against God, even though they claim to follow Jesus. Because the thing about these false teachers is they claim to follow Jesus, but they also added a bunch of stuff on top of it. And that's a difficult task, to discern whether or not they're genuine or not. So he goes on to say, "For they must be silenced, since they are upsetting whole families by teaching for shameful gain what they ought not teach. One of the Cretans, a prophet of their own, said, 'Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons.' This testimony is true. Therefore, rebuke them sharply, that they may be sound in the faith, not devoting themselves to Jewish myths and the commands of people who turn away from the truth." So the Titus and the elders are to teach against these people, the people who are causing heartache and drawing people away from faith, who are teaching lies for their own gain. And what is interesting in Paul's description of these people in that they need to be challenged is that he quotes one of the poets of Crete, Epimenides, to show just how bad the people of Crete generally are. Now, in my way of thinking, I got to thinking if when I first got here, a similar situation to me, if I were to first get here and somebody were to write me a letter and say, you know, the people of West Union, they're all a bunch of lazy idiots who don't know what they're talking about, and all they do is go to the restaurant and eat all the time. You know? If somebody were to write me a letter and say that's how y'all were, that's kind of how Paul is writing to Titus here. But it's not true. Y'all are good people. But so this is a rather harsh quote of their own poets that he's including in this letter. Why in the world are they doing that? Well, the interesting thing is that the people of Crete had a reputation of being hard-hearted, gluttonous, selfish people. Among themselves, they thought this, and they had a reputation from other Roman provinces of being hard-hearted, stubborn people, difficult people to deal with. And I think Paul is quoting that passage to remind Titus that even though there are individuals who cause problems, sometimes there are things within the culture itself that makes it difficult to do the job that Christ has given to us. That there are aspects of culture, there are attitudes, there are beliefs, there are ways of life that make spreading the gospel, recruiting good leaders, a difficult task. And in Crete, it happened to be that they were hard-hearted, that they tended to teach things that were untrue, and they tended to be selfish. Now, in our own world, there might be features of our culture that make it more likely for people to ignore the truth and be rebellious. In our country and in our area, we have people who are very self-sufficient, to say the least, that they don't need help from anybody. And so that can be challenging to say, you need Jesus. No, I've got this life thing by myself. Don't tell me what to do. I'm handling things all by myself. And so telling them that they need Jesus can be rather difficult. Or to say you need to submit to church leaders. I'm going to do this by myself. So they can be challenging in that way. In my generation, Generation Y, and the generation before mine, Generation X, we were taught to challenge all authority. You know, all authority is to be challenged. So we can be kind of jerks about that sometimes, and we can cause a lot of trouble. And so when you're talking to younger people who've been taught to challenge authority all of their lives, when you say to them, you know, there's authority in Jesus and the Bible and all this stuff, it is rather difficult sometimes to get them to submit. And also we have this idea that you can create your own reality and truth. So what is true for you is true for you. What is true for me is true for me. And that's okay. And so you can go about creating truth and living however you want. And so when you tell them about the truth, it is difficult. And this whole personal relationship with Jesus, where I don't need the church, I don't need other people, I don't need accountability, it's just me and God, that is also something to overcome. Okay, so he goes on to say in verse 15, to the pure all things are pure, but to the defiled and unbelieving nothing is pure, but both their minds and their consciences are defiled. They profess to know God, but they deny him by their works. They are detestable, disobedient, unfit for any good work. So here Paul is trying to tell Titus that for those who are trying to follow Jesus, that their lives are going to reflect that. But if they're just putting on a front, they might claim the name of Jesus, but they're only in it for themselves, you're going to know it by everything that they touch. They're going to affect negatively the things that they are involved with. And so it's going to be evident that these people are telling you to follow the ways of Moses and the ways of Jesus. You're going to see that that is going to not bear them good spiritual fruit in their lives. So instead, we are to be people who are pure, that our entire lives, our entire walk with Jesus affects every aspect of our lives. Because there's an interplay between our heart, our mind, and our will, and all of these need to be directed towards God. And this is why the spiritual requirements for elders are so important, that we need to be aligning ourselves with God's will. Otherwise, we can, as a group, lead the congregation in the wrong direction. But this is also why all of us need to submit to God's word and the guidance of prepared guides. We don't want to be like the false teachers who are just selfish and in it for themselves. Those who are unteachable and insubordinate. And we also need to be reminded that, like the church and the leaders, we're not supposed to imitate the culture of Crete, that we are to be different from the world. As Christians, we are not to follow the ways even of our own country, as good as it might be. We are not to imitate the world. We are to transform the world as we follow Jesus. And so when our country begins to get angry and violent, and there's a mob mentality that breaks out, there's this divisive attitude, whether it's between blacks and whites, Democrats or Republicans, liberals or conservatives, that we don't buy into it. When there is a party allegiance, that we stick to whatever party that we are part of or not a part of, to the detriment of ourselves or to our fellow Christian, or when our society is defensive. When we hear something that we don't like, we immediately go on the defense, we're offended, and we get hurt by it rather than listening to people and what's going on. We just get defensive and make excuses, and that is also not good. So we've got to avoid living like Crete. We've got to avoid living like the world, and we've got to live like Jesus. And that happens when we follow Jesus. We follow the guides that he has given to us. So in this chapter, it's a lot about the guides that we choose. Paul was giving Titus some qualities to look for in people, and for us to look for in leaders, but also to teach us something about who we should be following. It's not just about choosing the right people, but it is mostly about following the right people. So the thing I really want to hit home today is that we need to follow the right guides. There are all sorts of things that we can be following in life, in spiritual matters, in church life. We need to be following the right people. We could be following ourselves and our own desires. We can be following politicians, celebrities, sports stars. We could follow false teachers who write books and have TV shows. We could follow that person who stirs up trouble and is gossiping behind the scenes, and we don't really know about it, but they're sowing seeds of division. Or we could be following Jesus and the people that he has put in place to guide the flock. I think the choice from a biblical perspective is rather obvious, that we need to follow Jesus and we need to follow those that he has put in charge of the flock. In 2016, there were 3 British backpackers who wanted to climb a waterfall in Vietnam. There was a young man and 2 young women who had gotten a guide who, according to reports, was an unauthorized tour guide. In other words, he didn't have the right training. He didn't have the right preparation for the task. And so as they were on the top of the cliff next to the waterfall, they saw a whirlpool that was created by the stream, and they wanted to go into it. They thought that it would be safe. Look, the waters, they seem so calm. And so they headed towards it, the guy leading first, and the guide tries to shout out to them, "Stop, do not go in it," but they ignore his guidance and they get in anyway. And the guy goes in first and he tries to back up because he senses the danger, but he slips and he gets wiped out and taken down the waterfall. And before the guide could yell at the women to stand up and get out, they are also sucked into the waterfall, and all 3 of them died. This tragedy had 2 main causes. The first one was that they followed this unauthorized guide. He might have known the area, he might have known how to get them to the top of the waterfall, but he did not have the proper training or experience, especially in taking the right safety precautions and training in knowledge about how to deal with unruly tourists. What to do when they don't want to listen when you tell them to stop. And the second thing is that they did not listen to their guide when he gave them rather important life-saving information. So again, it's important for us to have the proper guides in physically dangerous activities. But it is even more important for us to have the right guides in matters of life and faith. And thankfully, we have the greatest guide in Jesus. But he has also given us prepared guides to help us navigate the adventures and challenges of this life. We actually have a really great group of elders in this congregation that we ought to listen to and follow. So let's follow the right guides and listen to their instruction.